Okay, let's get this started. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. My name is Bill Kartalopoulos. I'm the programming director for the MoCA Festival, and I'm really excited to be hosting this panel on comics and labor. Labor is a huge topic right now, and one of the things I wanted to do today is, first of all, it's just, I teach, and that will become obvious in a minute, talk for a few minutes, hopefully not too long, about some of the kind of interesting historical connections between comics and labor, because I think there's some really fascinating deep history in that area, and also history, of course, of exploitation within the comics. At the same time, of course, most people working in comics are freelancers, and the way American labor law functions, it's hard. Technically freelancers can't collectively organize, in the way that a labor union can, but that doesn't mean that there can't be, struggles for social justice in the comics world, as well as organized activity. So I'll start out with a little bit of history, but then we're going to talk about, praxis with the folks who are here today. So I'm not going to get into bios because I'll be showing a little bit about each of their work over the course of the hour. But for the moment, please join me in welcoming Lantz Arroyo, OK Fox, and Annabelle Heckler to MoCA today. So just in terms of some of the kind of more immediate impetus that got me thinking about doing a panel on comics and labor, as many of you may know, last fall, New School part-time faculty went on strike. I was among them. The New School part-time faculty is unionized. We're a local of the ACT-UAW, United Auto Workers. Because the New School includes Parsons, an art and design school, not unlike SVA, the Comics Caucus was well represented on the picket line during the month of the strike. And we really, and I don't want to get into the details of this particular strike right now, but it was a long and difficult strike. I mean, there are longer ones. Certainly the HarperCollins workers were on strike much longer, about 3 months. We were on strike for a month, but really we saw a lot. I mean, if you really want to learn about power, I would say go on strike, because you can, you really get to enjoy hearing someone spend a month telling you that it's absolutely impossible for them to do things that they eventually do. Because they need you to go back to work. Anyway, so, and there are a lot of people who make comics, who teach at Parsons, or involved with comics and related industries like illustration. And what I wanted to do was just kind of first, as I said, talk a little bit about the history, the context I feel that we kind of live in as it relates to comics and labor. And those connections really go back to the earliest days of the American newspaper comic strip. I'm not going to do a whole history of comics, but as we all know, comics in America as a mass medium initially started out as the Sunday comics, kind of this kind of special full color section in the American newspaper that initially came out once a week, and then because it was so popular by around 1912, the daily comic strip pages became a standard part of the American newspaper, sometimes one page, sometimes many pages. And now, of course, most people consume news online, but I'm at least old enough to have read, Peanuts and Calvin and Hobbes and stuff like that in newspapers when I was a kid. And what's really interesting about this history is that comics were such a mass medium. They're such an important mass medium at that time. And again, keep in mind, certainly this is before television, before most people have radios in their homes. The newspaper is an important daily source of information and also entertainment. And comics were so big that not only were they part of mainstream newspapers, but they were also part of alternative newspapers, things like the Black Press, which had its own comic strips, and the Labor Press, and in left-wing newspapers. And we see this first in the Industrial Worker. The Industrial Worker was the newspaper organ of the industrial workers of the world, also known as the Wobblies. And again, we don't have time to go deeply into this history, but the Wobblies were a radical labor union that called for an international approach to labor, one that transcended trade union separations. And in fact, they were often critical of the established trade unions, who they saw as merely functioning as essentially middlemen between labor and management that essentially worked to contain the ambitions of workers rather than to promote them. And anyway, in 1912, the Industrial Worker debuted a comic strip featuring a character called Mr. Block. And the idea of Mr. Block initially is that Mr. Block is a worker, but he's also a blockhead. Pretty literal name. He's a blockhead, and he doesn't understand the value of the union and specifically of the IWW. So I mean, this is a very kind of detailed image of Mr. Block here, and we see him saying, me join the IWW? No, that's for working men. I'm better than that, and this is a more typical image of Mr. Block, a little less detailed in the images. Don't start talking again about that IWW. I don't believe in it. And Mr. Block was created by an artist named Ernest Reba, who I don't actually know a lot about. I've got a little bit more information on him, but this is a typical example of a Mr. Block strip, and we see that Mr. Block is credulous. Basically, he believes what the mainstream press tells him. He believes what the bosses tell him. So it begins with him throwing a copy of the Industrial Worker into the furnace and saying, this anarchist paper from Spokane is the limit. It says a working man can't get rich by saving his money. Tain't so. Then he's reading the Saturday Evening Post. Here's a respectable paper. It says everyone can be successful if he only makes up his mind, So he puts his, he invests in this, he invests his savings in this mining company. It took him 10 years of hard labor to save this money, and he says the ambition of my life will soon be realized. I'll be rich and won't have to work anymore. And then of course the company goes out of business, it collapses, his funds weren't insured, but the people who started this investment project are flying off in a dirigible, saying, meet me in Monte Carlo. So, they took the money and run. And so Mr. Block got duped again. And there's a little article about Ernst Reba in the Daily Worker with a great quote where it says, fellow worker Ernest Reba promises to supply us regularly with his excellent cartoons, both for the front page and for the Mr. Block series. He asks no compensation for his services. He says, every rebel should do his share for the emancipation of his class. I will do mine. Okay, and he also did some other, he did like political cartoons for the IWW, and there's a book of his cartoons and so on. In 1913, there was a little booklet that was published of Mr. Block cartoons, and that was reprinted later in like the 80s. But probably the most well-distributed version of Mr. Block wasn't even a cartoon, but rather a song in the so-called Little Red Songbook, the little book of IWW songs. And Joe Hill, who was killed by the American government, who was a labor activist, wrote a song called Mr. Block. I'll just play, I have the whole song, but I'll just play a few seconds of it just so you can hear it.
Please give me your attention. I'll introduce to you a man that is a credit to our red, white, and blue. His head is made of lumber and solid as a rock. He is a common worker and his name is Mr. Block. And Block he thinks he may be president someday. Oh, Mr. Block, you were born by mistake. You take the cake, you make me ache. Tie a rock on your block and then jump in the lake. Kindly do that for liberty's sake.
Okay. Anyway, that's just a little bit of Mr. Block. But I think a lot of people maybe who hadn't even seen the comic strip might have heard that song, because that Little Red Songbook was reprinted many times and was frequently used in labor struggles. Now, of course, Mr. Block, appeared in a pretty small circulation, left-wing newspaper. The regular mainstream newspapers featured much more well-known comic strip characters, and again, during this period of the first half of the 20th century, the daily comic strip, huge mass media, and the people who made popular comic strips themselves could often become quite wealthy. So this is an article from 1935 in the middle of the Great Depression, and we see, just as one example, Bud Fisher, who created Mutt and Jeff, his weekly income in 1935 was $1,800 a week. It's about $100,000 a year, but in 1935, in the middle of the Great Depression, one out of 4 Americans is out of work. He basically was a multimillionaire. And one of these famous successful cartoonists was Harold Gray. Does anybody know which comic Harold Gray created? Anyone in the back? Yes.
Little Orphan Annie.
Little Orphan Annie, there she is. Yes, Little Orphan Annie. And if you haven't seen the Little Orphan Annie comic strip, maybe you've seen one of the movie adaptations. Maybe you appeared in a school production of Little Orphan Annie. I wouldn't be shocked to know there's some former orphans in the room. It's frequently staged with casts of little kids. But as if you don't know, Harold Gray, who created Little Orphan Annie, had a pretty hard right libertarian political attitude, political ideology, I should say. And in particular, there was one series of one narrative in Little Orphan Annie where there's an inventor named Eli Eon who creates this miracle substance called Eonite that's going to transform the world and make everything better. And Daddy Warbucks, the benevolent war profiteer who adopts Little Orphan Annie, connects with Eli Eon, and they form a partnership, and he's going to build a factory to create this Eonite that's going to transform the world and solve all our problems. But then, of course, another rival industrialist hires these meddling union organizers to go in and try and organize this Eonite factory, and we see them sort of scheming, and saying, above all, we must keep them organized, otherwise we cannot collect our dues, and my friends, do not forget the initiation fees and the fines and the assessments. We should call a strike at once, but what should we demand? We could demand a 4-hour day, yes, and demand double wages, that should be popular and would gain us wide attention and new followers to pay dues. So this is the kind of even third partying we still experience today, when there's that kind of labor struggle, where the union is sort of treated not as the representative of the workers, but rather this outside body that has these kind of self-interested motivations and is just sort of using the workers as pawns. And anyway, this storyline continued, and initially the labor organizers are rejected because Daddy Warbucks' workers are so satisfied with his wonderful employment, but then eventually, because of their meddling, the factory burns down, and this wonderful Eonite is destroyed forever, and we lose our chance to live in Daddy Warbucks' utopia. But anyway, the New Republic had an article about this storyline called Fascism and the Funnies, critiquing Harold Gray's anti-unionism. And in another newspaper, the Daily Worker, which was essentially the American organ of the Communist Party USA, CPUSA, there was this kind of answer comic called Little Lefty. And it's funny because the first episode of Little Lefty is called Capitalist Comics Get a Shock. And so you see all these characters like Popeye, Little Orphan Annie, and the Katzenjammer kids being confronted by Little Lefty, the new popular comic strip character of the Daily Worker. And the first one looks pretty crude, but you can see from these later episodes, it's actually got some pretty interesting, evocative, and atmospheric art. And in this is from a storyline where Little Lefty organizes a newsboy strike. Kind of like if you've seen Newsies, for example, that's sort of the scenario. Now, in the main, of course, the newspaper industry was a very lucrative industry, but then there was this sort of parallel cheap, low-budget industry that emerges in the 30s, which is the comic book industry, which initially was just based on cheaply reprinting popular daily comic strips, and that all changed when Superman debuted in 1938 and made the comic book a site not just for familiar characters, but new characters and even new genres like the superhero. And as probably many of you know, the Superman character was created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, two young men from Cleveland. And they sold the first Superman story to the company that would become DC Comics, now part of Time Warner, AOL, some plus. I don't know what else is in the Verizon. I don't know, whatever's in the conglomerate these days. They sold that to that company for $130. And that included not just the rights to that story, but all rights to the character. And Superman has gone on to earn a lot more than $130. And only because there was a kind of public, kind of a public relations issue in the 70s, Neil Adams and some others championed Siegel and Shuster to make sure that they could get a pension from DC and get credit for having created the character when the Superman movie came out. There have been attempts to organize the comic book industry. One of them was led by Bernard Krigstein. Does anybody know what Bernard Krigstein's most famous comic book story is?
It's the one of chasing on the subway train
exactly.
platform, but I forget what it's called. Thank you.
Yes, exactly. Master Race.
Repressed, what it was
by
called.
DC Comics in the 50s, which was, among other things, one of the first, significant comic stories about the Holocaust, and also features just really fantastic visual storytelling, depictions of time and movement. And Krigstein, said, I took the position that comics were great art, and that we were in fact fine artists and illustrators. I felt it was vital that we should understand our own unique talents and value our work. And he started an organization, very short-lived, called the Society of Comic Book Illustrators, and with the idea that they could unionize the body of workers, and he was essentially blackballed by Marvel and DC for doing this. And I just want to add one detail. I like at the bottom of the header of this flyer, or the header of the bulletin, don't forget, free beer. You got to get them in the door, whatever works, right? But anyway, but nevertheless, and this is part of a history of exploitation, that includes, among other things, like Jack Kirby not getting credit, for substantially co-creating the Marvel characters, and certainly not being compensated for that. And the only real example, again, we do have this kind of tricky labor issue where freelancers can't collectively bargain in the United States under national labor law. But the closest thing really actually, to a union of independent comics artists happened during the underground comics period. And this was a period, if you don't know a lot about it, where there were, young people who were involved with the counterculture, the American, what we think of as the hippie movement, producing a large body of comics that they were working without editorial oversight, they were working without censorship. These works were being distributed principally through independent bookstores and head shops, which have now been replaced by CBD shops. But anyway, the young people who were involved with making these comics formed a kind of unofficial union called the United Cartoon Workers of America. Again, they weren't actually collectively bargaining with publishers, but what they were all doing was abiding by a standard set of professional ethics that included that, just rules like every artist owns the copyright to their own work. A publisher only buys the right to print the work, right? And the artist can always take that right back. And also they abided by standardized page rates, so that they reinforced a kind of situation where comics artists were getting paid more like literary authors, meaning what they got as a page rate was an advance against royalties. Okay, so they weren't being employed by the publisher they were being given in advance against royalties that the publisher was using to buy the first right to publish the work, which is how literary publishing works. So essentially they're saying we want to be treated like authors, we're not work for hire. So anyway, yeah, I love the United Cartoon Workers of America. They made all these buttons with the different locals like Milwaukee, San Francisco, New York. I'm very lucky. I've got a New York button. I've also seen pictures of these T-shirts. That's Kim Deitch's late brother, Simon Deitch, and Kim was here yesterday wearing United Cartoon Workers of America with the with the memorable slogan, "Don't fuck with us." And just to bring that down to the present, while independent artists can't organize, employees of comic book publishers can. And some of you may have heard of the Comic Book Workers United, which is a recently formed union that was formed by employees of Image Comics who ratified their first contract this year in March. So that's interesting. So anyway, that's just a bit of context and background. I apologize if I went on too long. But nevertheless, what I want to do now is, having gone through a little bit of that context, talk about some work in the present and how we can apply some of these principles to what we're doing today. So we can see comics functioning both as ways that unions and labor movements communicate with people, or things, a kind of discourse that can be supportive of, or in the case of Little Orphan Annie, critical of labor unions, but also too, attempts to bring, the values of workplace democracy into the comics field. So with that, I want to turn first to Lantz. Now, Lantz, you are here, and you're one of the both workers and owners of Radix Media, printing and publishing. And when one goes to the Radix Media website, the very first thing you see is this piece of information. Radix Media is a worker-owned printer and publisher. Can you talk a little bit about what Radix is and how it came together?
Sure. Got my corn dog here. Thanks, everybody. Radix Media started on the West Coast in Portland, Oregon, which was just me and a single color offset print shop. But I had worked in worker cooperatives before and knew that I wanted Radix to someday be a worker cooperative. So when I relocated back to the East Coast, I got some folks to join up with, and just kind of a long story, but basically we started offering different commercial print services as a worker cooperative in 2012 or so in Brooklyn, New York. And then we expanded into literary publishing in 2018 with the release of our book called Aftermath, Explorations of Loss and Grief, which is an anthology that we did an open call for submissions for. And then we did all the editing, all the design, all the printing, all the binding. We do everything in-house. So for us, it was kind of, publishing and printing being sort of like a very fragmented industry is relatively new. Back in the old days, like the author, the printer, and the publisher were often like the same person. So for us, it's about taking kind of that history and being able to take, a blank sheet of paper and actually make books out of it while owning the means of production and being able to have that control over it. And so we do things for our books that, like, probably most other publishers can't do because it's too expensive. Like, we do, foil stamping and, end sheets for chapbooks and stuff like that. We just try to make it really nice. And basically the logic is that we already have the stuff to print your stuff. We should use it to make our stuff, as nice as possible. So that's kind of like our guiding principle whenever we're publishing and printing books, even if it's like a smaller project. We always try to do something that's a little bit nicer than what you otherwise could get.
Yeah, and I'm kind of interested in both the printing and the publishing part. It's funny because, there's a picture on your site, I think on your site, or maybe I got this someplace else. I guess these are the three people who are principally involved with Radix Media at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And Sarah Lopez, we see on the left there, had actually been my student years ago at Parsons. And I knew about Radix Media because I knew about some of the comics that you've been publishing. You've done three. You've done a series called The Solar Grid.
Mm-hmm.
You've done several, I think, have all 10 issues of that come out now?
No, that's it's up to issue 7, and issue 8 is going to be coming out later this year.
Okay, so this is a series called The Solar Grid. I'm just showing the covers of the first few issues just so people can see, by an artist named Ganzir, and we can talk about that a little bit. And there's also this other graphic novel that you published called Mortals, written by John Dermot Woods, and drawn by Matt L. So I want to go back to that stuff, but what was really not funny, but I mean, it was just kind of a happy surprise to me was that when we were on strike at the new school, we were like on strike, we had these little like design, elements and so on, and stickers and buttons and all this stuff. And then someone told me like, oh yeah, we get all that stuff printed at Radix Media. And I was just like, oh, I know about them. They publish comics, and my former students, then I went on your site, and political printing is a whole category of what you do. So I'm kind of interested in both how this kind of like client work as a printer and the publishing that you do relate to the ideals that also structure the company. So I guess with something maybe like The Solar Grid or the graphic novel Mortals, can you talk about, like, first of all, how that work came to you, and then also how it is a reflection, how these works reflect the ideals, I guess, of the company?
Sure. Yeah, the work came to us. John Dermot Woods actually wrote another story called Always Blue that we published under as part of our Futures science fiction series, which was a series that was published monthly. Once it really was monthly, like all the editorial, all the printing. It was actually kind of a crazy idea, and we won't do it again. But but we did do it, and it's one of my favorite things we've ever published, actually. But John lives in the neighborhood. I think we probably printed like one of his like mini comics probably like 10 years ago or something, and he just kind of knew who we were, and we kind of kept in touch, and he was like read our newsletter. So he ended up like kind of pitching us this idea as something that he was working on with Matt. And then with The Solar Grid, that was something that Ganzir has been, that's kind of like his opus. He's been like working, he does all kinds of stuff. He was big in Egypt for, during the Arab Spring for his like street art and graffiti, but he's really talented, does all kinds of different prints, and he's also some work for hire and things like that too, so he does lots of stuff, but he's been working on this for a really long time. And we essentially co-publish, where essentially he's providing the labor of creating all of the work, and we're handling all the production and the marketing and the sales and stuff like that, and then we just split the run. So it's a little bit of a weird kind of special project because the run is not super long, but I think that with us, like, the structure is important. The fact that we're worker owned, the fact that we can decide on projects together, we decide on the look of projects, paper, it really is collaborative. And, for us, when we were getting into publishing, I think what people tend to want to envision, like, political, publishing as is something like a nonfiction publisher like AK Press or PM Press, where they're publishing all really good books, but mostly like political nonfiction. And for us, it was just like, well, we're more interested in comics, we're more interested in prose and short stories and poetry and science fiction, but like, how can we make that political? And so for that, being worker owned is really important because it's, there's no bosses there, there's no like, executive making, whatever amount of money, while there's like, assistants and, things like that who are not getting paid. We always want things to be pretty horizontal, and just work on things together. And I think that it leads to a less burnout. I mean, it's still a ton of work, but it means that we share responsibilities more, and it means the books come out better because it's got a number of people that care about it. They're actually like invested in like the success of that book. So you might not look at something like Mortals, which is about a man who's like a struggling actor who has like a shit home life and is going through this crisis of his last part that he's going to play. But for us, it kind of still is political in a way because the circumstances in which it's made is under, it's published by a worker cooperative. So we just try to, anything that we do, we try to kind of stick that in there, and that informs that.
Yeah, and of course the solar grid at least has the also. I mean, it's a kind of environmental. It's a reflection on say environmental catastrophe, but in a science fictional kind of way.
The solar grid is very political.
Yeah.
In case you didn't know,
yeah.
in case you couldn't figure it out.
And also I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about too functioning as a printer, but a printer that I guess you might say specializes in doing work that supports movements.
Yeah, I mean, we're really weird, I think. People don't understand us. Are you a printer? Are you a publisher? We actually made a Venn diagram that we post on Twitter. Like, no, it's as if you're like favorite small press, like had a printing press in the back. That's like who we are. Because there's lots of other things out there like vanity publishing and self-publishing, and we're more similar to a small press, like independent publisher that just happens to have like all the things and with which to make these books. So sometimes it's a little bit confusing, and we kind of have to, depending on what we're doing, kind of have to like look at the audience that we're trying to engage with. But yeah, I mean, the idea kind of from the get-go was that the commercial work sort of like subsidizes the publishing. In reality, it doesn't totally work like that, but it does help, and it does mean that we can kind of be smart with things like paper and design, and we can kind of design things in accordance with like what we have. And so, but it also means we can advise people on their projects too. So we print lots of stuff like postcards and business cards and brochures for events and things like that. But then we also print plenty of comics and chapbooks and books and things like that as well.
And how did you connect with the ACT-UAW and start doing work for them?
I'm not even sure. I think it just was it was an email that came in, and we do quite a lot of work for a lot of unions and unionizing workers. But yeah, it just kind of came up, and we're always happy to do that stuff. I mean, we consider ourselves a movement print shop. Like, no matter how much publishing we do, like, we wouldn't be here without like the politics that informed all of that and made us like want to start doing this in a cooperative manner. So for us, it's like, like we did some like pro bono printing for the New Yorker union. And it was actually for stuff that they didn't end up using because they didn't actually end up going on strike, but they came very close. We printed a lot of stuff for the HarperCollins union, which, as you mentioned, they were on strike for an absurd amount of time, like through the holidays. The year changed over and they like went back to being on strike. It's really pretty ridiculous. But we always, we always look for ways to support movements because that's often the thing that people need when they're in the streets. They need flyers and stickers and leaflets and things like that. In early COVID, when all the Black Lives Matter protests were breaking out that summer, we couldn't really access we could go in, but our shop was shut down because we weren't like essential or whatever. So we were mostly all at home, but we were designing graphics, and also once we were able to go back in, we were printing posters that just on the digital press, but we could just print 100 or 200 or 300 posters like that day and then send them out to protests. And so people use them. I mean, there's a photo in the New York Times of like this huge mass of people and someone's playing one of our posters, which is pretty cool. So yeah, we just we always try to support movement shops because we consider ourselves part of the various movements.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. I want to ask OK a few questions.
Oh, sure.
I remember the first sort of kind of public, I remember meeting you just kind of through the comics world, and I remember you came to like
I'm a scene creature.
Brooklyn Comics and Graphics Festival, for those who remember that. And
That's right.
you probably, I mean, did you ever come over to the loft for the cartoon?
I did,
Yeah.
yeah.
You did the parties and stuff. That's for another panel. But,
Love a party panel.
yeah. We should just do a panel on just like, hey, remember that party?
Remember the parties?
That
They
one
were
party
great.
was great. But the first sort of public kind of, I guess, you know, like quote unquote political thing that I remember you being involved with was in the wake of
That's
the
right. There I
allegations
am.
that came out around Art Forum in 2017. And I made sure to get the font size small enough so you could see
There you
your
go.
name among the signatories. So I guess you were working
That's
at
right.
Art Forum, and I'm actually I only have a vague recollection of what the precise situation was, but as I just remember, there was just a really big, like, high-level Me Too kind of situation at
Yep.
Art Forum, and the people who worked there were really disappointed with the
It was
response.
right in the heart of Harvey Weinstein Me Too. This is
Yeah.
2017 or so. This is like right at the breaking Me Too moment. Everybody on their Facebook status is sharing their deepest traumas constantly. I was working receptionist. I used to be an issue packer for Art Forum and Book Forum for like 4 years, and then they promoted me to front desk. But you know, I definitely took a pay cut taking full time, and I hated it. And then you know we were always told to open the mail, and one day we opened the mail, and it was a lawsuit of a former employee in there's two receptionists, so in our position. And I remember we were at the PS1 art book fair tabling for Art Forum, and like my coworker showing me the lawsuit. She took pictures on her phone, and I was like, all right, we got to do something. I don't know what. I was like very young. I'm 32 now, so I was like, yeah, in my, I don't know, 24, 25. My politics weren't nearly as developed as they are now. But I knew like that the MoMA was historically unionized with UAW since the 70s. And I knew about like News Guild, and I knew about like there was an art handler alliance at the and I just like was reaching out to like anybody, me and like a couple of my coworkers, trying to get anybody to fucking email us back, and nobody would. So things at the very least have gotten to the point where a union will answer your email, which is great. But that was how we started Art and Labor podcast, was in the wake of that, using my unemployment money as seed funding.
Yeah.
You've been doing this Art and Labor podcast. This is a picture, I think, of
Me and
you
Lucia.
With Lucia, but I think you also have another co-host now.
Yes, Sarah Crow, who's
Right.
incredible at.
But this is the OG duo.
That's right.
So can you talk about what motivated Art and Labor? And also I'm interested in kind of hearing both like what your sense is as to why a podcast on this subject was something that you were motivated to do, and also too like what you see as maybe. Oh, well, let's just start there. Let's just start there.
Yeah, so me and Lucia Love, who's an incredible painter, went to SVA, killing it. We were in a Marxist feminist reading group that was part of the DSA, and it kind of like got I don't know. We were into it, but then we kept like, you know, talking after reading group at the bar and just being like, we gotta do something about the art world. We gotta figure it out. Because I just wanted to like go interview my friends and like ask all the hard questions. Be like, yeah, let's really figure this out. Let's game this all out. I don't know. I had come from the perspective of going to SUNY Purchase for undergrad for printmaking, and I was living in Manhattan. I had a lot of friends at SVA, and I was like, dude, your school is for profit? That's like fucking insane. Like I don't know, we should all talk about like why in the 70s all these groups like made all these gains to provide like free or cheap education to people, and like where did we go wrong? How are we losing those gains that were made.
Right. Well, and even, I think that probably was, I don't remember exactly what year it was, not too long after Cooper Union
Yes.
started charging tuition too, after historically being a free school.
Yes.
So you've been doing this podcast, and you've been kind of in talking to people who are involved with a lot of different aspects of the art world.
That's right.
And also, for a while, I don't think this is active right now, but I also know for a while you were involved with an organization that was very specifically, it's like SVA, you're on notice.
Alex
Also,
Deegan.
comics festivals. There was a kind of organization. I guess I don't know if it's dormant now or how you would characterize it, or at least an attempt to kind of organize cartoonists based on kind of and it's a sort of interesting approach because you're taking you took the position that cartoonists exhibiting at festivals are workers. They provide the content and take all the risk, right? So it's like you pay for the table, you may or may not make your table back, but the festival definitely gets your table fee.
Well, I come out of tenant organizing, so
Right.
I think the first thing to do, especially a lot of you young people, is ground yourself where you live. Like, you have to give a shit about the neighborhood you live in enough to be like, I'm gonna stay here and I'm gonna figure that out, because that's what the underground cartoonists that we were talking about earlier, I think of Spain Rodriguez, who worked with Up Against the Wall Motherfuckers and Black Mask, and these groups that were doing radical zine work and radical cartoon work together. What they had was the gift of proximity. What they had was cheap Manhattan rent that was won by Jewish, Black, Puerto Rican tenant organizing that won rent control. And rent control was not a thing that existed before that organizing happened in New York City, where we all are. And that history can ground us in our next steps for organizing. So I come out of tenant organizing and I see festivals as a form of tenancy, right? There's a landlordism that's happening. You are being charged a wage for a table that is being charged for land, and it's like, are there even discounts for SVA students? These are your facilities. You pay for these facilities. You know what I mean? These are things that a student union can fight for. These are things that there's lots of ways to make a union, was our point with making festival workers, was okay, we do this a lot, so let's talk about it. I came out of doing the festival at Silent Barn, which was a collectively run art space. Alabaster Pizzo legend.
First called Paper Jam and then later Paper Jazz.
Paper Jazz. Rebrand. Due to
hard reboot.
yeah. Had to do it sometimes. Sometimes there's cis white dudes who are very fragile and you have to do a rebrand. But yeah, that's kind of where I was coming from, was I made these festivals first through SUNY Purchase, where we had funding through, there's a mandatory student activity fee at Purchase that students vote on every year. And that's a good amount of budget for students to make activities, events, whatever. We flew in people using money from the LGBTQ club. We were able to pay artists to come to our little school in Westchester from the city to come, enrich the students. We're all tabling together. Tables were free, obviously. It's possible to make a festival that is profitable for everybody involved. And it doesn't have to be the way they are right now.
And I think this inserted a lot of good ideas into the conversation anyway. And I think some of these ideas too are have gained some traction, but still I think the idea that really the exhibiting artists, can almost democratically be involved in making the festival still seems like an ambitious reach, given the way so many of these are organized right now, where there's like a single entity, whether it's like a person who owns a comic store,
Right.
or an organizational society,
A person who owns a
illustrator,
comic store.
or whoever, who organizes the festival. And I did want to just briefly mention, you mentioned tenant organizing, and you are also
Nice.
involved with the Ridgewood Tenants Union.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. On and off in leadership, we're figuring our shit out.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, what I love is just how many ideas are being seeded already. I mean, even again, if we've been talking about them for a while, I think they're new for a lot of folks maybe who are in the room. And
Yeah.
then finally, I want to also make sure we look at Annabelle's work too. Annabelle Heckler, you actually have a background working in the labor movement. You worked, you told me, for several years in the 1199 SEIU, and now you're a labor strategist.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what that all means?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was gonna ask, actually, maybe this is a little off script, but could we do a little, who here in the room is a union member? I definitely see your Starbucks Workers United. You wanna shout out, there's not that many of you, shout out your unions. NISNA, APWU, SAG-AFTRA,
Retired from the staff union at PSC CUNY.
PSC CUNY Staff Union. And did I hear one more? UAW, great. All right. And then who here works a job? Okay. Okay. And who here is freelance? Okay. And I would just say, like, just because labor law excludes us who are freelancers doesn't mean we don't have the right to organize. So, and puts us in the same league as a bunch of precarious workers, like deliveristas, et cetera, who we should all be working together, and we bring some cool skills to that table. So anyway, so I worked for 11 years for 1199 SEIU, doing union research, so helping workers who wanted to organize a union at their jobs to be able to fight and win the union. And then I spent 4 years working for the city, so working with all of the public sector unions, so PSC, CUNY, et cetera. And I've been freelance for 4 years since, primarily because I wanted to spend more time than just my 8 hours for what I will drawing comics. So.
Yeah. So you've got that background working in and with unions, but as you said, you're also a comics artist. I know you've published work in World War III Illustrated and other venues. This is a piece that you shared with me about organized marine stewards. Or can you talk a little bit about what this is?
Yeah, for sure. So this is a comic that was originally published in Labor Notes, and it's about the Marine Cooks and Stewards Union, which was a 1930s through 50s union that was part of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, so sort of the next radical federation of labor unions after the IWW. And they, I think one thing that I was appreciating you saying, like, history grounding us. Sorry, I'm completely visual, so I've been taking notes to try and remember things. But just how very radical the labor movement of the 1930s, 40s, and early 50s, pre sort of McCarthyism and state crackdown, can look from even our perspective today. So this was a union that was self-describedly red, black, and queer, and very militant. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and you talk about the crackdown. I mean, there's a reference to Taft-Hartley, and that was a big.
So, and this is a drawing from a comic by a CIO comics artist. The Taft-Hartley, like Taft-Hartley as the cop.
Oh, really?
Specifically. I'm forgetting their name now, so apologies.
Yeah, yeah. And you've done a lot of other work. This is on this subject. This is, I know that a lot of what you do is kind of the labor notes too, and you mentioned before that like comics, labor, and queer issues is like your perfect like Venn diagram, and you have something called Mighty Gay Union. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a comic that I drew for the workers at Howard Brown Health Center in Chicago, who just organized their union in August. And then in December, the bosses, as their first negotiating session, were like, we're laying off 61 of you. And so they went out on strike for 3 days in defense of their coworkers. And so this is, again, I'm not that creative. It was freezing in Chicago those days and like freezing rain, and they went out on the picket line and did all of these like crazy sort of dance-a-thons. Those signs are like relatives of signs on the picket line, and they like did a song that was like "We Are the Union, the Mighty Gay Union." This is like a flyer you see for a Labor Notes event that we did a few weeks ago.
And what's this piece here?
This one is for my coworkers at 1199 actually, but I think just for, and who here considers themselves involved in a social movement in one way or another? Okay. And who here is a student full-time? Okay, a bunch, just trying to get and again, as OK said, there's like amazing, absolutely, students all age levels. So there's lots of space to organize wherever you are. So this one is about the connections between social movements, and specifically, so there was, in 1981 when Ronald Reagan fired the air traffic controllers for striking, there was one of those fired air traffic controllers that lost their job, went to jail, because, this was when Ronald Reagan made union busting like Little Orphan Annie style, safe for everybody. And when he got out of jail, he came out of the closet, moved across the country to Washington, D.C., and started working. It was the heart of the AIDS crisis, which also Ronald Reagan, again, our movements are intersectional no matter where you are. So Ronald Reagan refused to say AIDS for most of his administration. It was Bill Taylor was one of the workers that organized a union at those AIDS clinics. And there was also a big organizing campaign in New York at a gay men's health crisis where workers won their union, but then actually because of union busting, were never able to win a contract. And there's a bunch more AIDS HIV service centers that are union today, and some that have organized in the past years. So like Howard Brown, workers at another big LGBT health center are organizing right now as we speak. Cal and Lord here in New York won their union in 2014, etc. So.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too that the intersectionality of it, because it's very even at the new school it was very interesting to kind of be striking in front of a building that like advertises its kind of social justice ethos. It's like they have like names of courses on the building, and the ones they're advertising are like Marxism and revolution or whatever, but it's like so that's interesting, because the structure of the employer-employee relationship, even within the context of the kind of progressive institutions and organizations that you're talking about, the idea that they still have to fight to win a union and fight to win a contract is interesting, and maybe not intuitive to everyone who comes at these issues from outside. Can you explain a little bit about how you see the comics work you're doing fitting into the more kind of like on the ground labor strategizing that you also do as a freelancer now?
That's a great question. I think there's a few things, like the Mighty Gay Unions piece, and then I don't know, I've done a handful of pieces for friends and other unions over the past handful of years, is kind of like fan art for like, I love you, I'm in solidarity with you, like, let me shout you out. And so I think, and that is like a nice, just like, I don't know, it's mostly stuff I've drawn for like friends and comrades so far, and it's mostly just like shouting out. It kind of like a similar vein to showing up at the like abortion rally right after the Dobbs decision and finding all of those like abort the court Radix Media posters or whatever. And then I think the history stuff is like, I personally prefer books with words and pictures. So I've always loved comics, and so it feels like a good way to render some of that history, which I think is like an important place to ground us in building good movements, as like accessible and fun and pleasing to people.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I think it's important too to kind of be making this work when you're not like actively in the middle of a struggle yourself, because I mean what I experienced too when we were striking in the fall is that, I mean, you've got all these creative, motivated people, and they get together, and there's like, the beginning is like the biggest brainstorm you've ever seen in your life. It was like, we could do this, we could do that, we could make a newspaper and distribute it every day on the line, we could do that, you know, it's like everyone has a million ideas, and they're all great, but also too, like, everyone has a certain amount of energy, and even just doing, you know, and I think too, there's a kind of, you know, I think sometimes people look at strikes and they're like, they always do the same thing. They march up and down and make the same chants and, you know, wave the same signs and everything. But it's also like, it takes a lot just of organizing just to do that, just to put the basic foundational stuff in place. And people are doing this all like in addition to living their lives and with the anxiety of losing income hanging over their heads too. You know, so it's like, yeah, we've got, you know, so at the beginning everyone's like, oh, they're gonna be sorry they messed with all us creative artists. We're gonna be so creative with our outpouring of product over, but really it's like, after a while, like just showing up every day is like enough, like more taxing than you can imagine. So it's like, you know, when there's like, oh, there's already art, maybe like this person can do something for us who's not, you know, they're not marching every day, or they can let us reprint this thing that already exists or whatever. I mean, the fact that there are people sort of paying attention when the great mass of workers are just doing their jobs the rest of the time is I think, helpful and important too. And definitely, I think, you know, the point that you all made about grounding in history is very important.
Can I say another funny one?
Yeah.
On the previous slide, I think, Annabelle had this, the Be Gay, Do Strike.
Oh.
The Be Gay, Do Crimes print that got really virally popular, made by Io Iscarum, who's a really awesome cartoonist and publisher in their own right, and anarchist activist too. But that image is originally from the Paris Commune. He was called Henry the Skeleton, and he was throwing Molotov cocktails. And in '68, during like the uprisings in '68, up against the wall motherfuckers, who were, you know, radical artist group here in New York, repurposed Henry the Skeleton to say up against the wall motherfuckers, and so that and the original sash on the, you know, it always said like anarchist, communist, like from the days of the Paris Commune and until now.
Pretty amazing.
Grounding. I think the first 2 episodes of Art and Labor are about that, if you guys are interested.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I do want to ask you another question about art and labor. Like, I feel like there's been a real wave of organizing since you started that podcast, and even just like, even lots of, I mean, I don't know about anyone else, but I follow a fair number of basically like posting meme accounts on Instagram that call out various industries, like there's one, like, I mean, the Art Handlers Union or something like that.
Another
Art
Teamsters
Handler.
local.
And there's like Publishers versus Assistants or something.
The early New Museum Union memes were so good.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about a place that started with a very deep radical history that was completely stripped away.
Yeah.
Great
Yeah.
memes.
But,
Wonder who makes them.
No, but I mean, how do you see the landscape as someone who sort of started covering this stuff before, you know, before it was like this sort of, almost like chain reaction that's been gaining momentum over the last few years?
I do think it's much better than it was when I was trying to get a union to answer my email in 2017. You know, one of our very early Art and Labors we're live on a picket in front of the MoMA Gala, and these are moments like I feel like these types of moments we need more of, like going to where the rich people are, doing an action where the rich people are. Because like we ran into Jeff Koons and we got to like yell at him, and it's like live on the recording forever, which is like really great. But there's all these things that are being like stripped away from us, that I think we do need to like kind of go back and do some struggle sessions soon within the labor movement, because I think we're at a point where people the interest is higher than ever, but the execution I think is lacking, and we're losing. And I think like there needs to be an honest like reckoning about that and like recalibration. And David Graeber, before he died, wrote a series of pieces for Eflux Journal that I think are very worth reading, kind of about the institution's role in like the police state, in the surveillance state. Why does the institution push AI? Why does the institution push the internet? The internet gentrified comics. The internet is like if we're all printmakers here, we're all doing our own small press economies. We can't be working with the internet because we don't have control over that tool. We can't be using Adobe because we don't have control over that tool. So I don't know. I think there needs to be a reckoning, and I think we need to really seriously think about Luddism, not in the way it's commonly understood, in the way of like the Luddites weren't anti-tools. They were anti not having control over their tools and having and being anti-middle management. So how do we work with that while we all have phones or whatever? Because it can't scale, is my main point. The internet cannot scale. It cannot. The planet cannot handle it. So it's actually an imperative to environment and the planet to figure out how to work on these things better, how to organize better.
Yeah, well, and I think that's what maybe it leads to maybe a good open question, which is, people make comics, they function within systems, they're performing a lot of labor. At the same time, as you said, everyone's almost got this little individualistic, entrepreneurial kind of economy that they exist, within. How, and as you pointed out too, you don't need to be in a union to organize, right? I mean, there are ways of organizing that aren't just forming a union and bargaining collectively for a contract. So what are some of the things that you think people should maybe think about doing where they are within this, community / economy / confluence that we find ourselves in right now?
I mean, for like going back to the Graeber piece really quick, he talks about institutions being part of the surveillance apparatus. Certain institutions I think we need to let go of. Marvel, we need to fucking let go of. Let it die with Stan Lee. Everybody's freaking out about that right now. We don't need it anymore. We don't need it. We need to make new work, and we need to support new work and collectivize that process more. And I think part of that is making bigger worker-owned institutions, larger, ones that can scale, ones that people trust, and ones that give people a better deal and work hand in hand with other unions. I think the point of unionizing, to me, as a internationalist Marxist, is to organize every part of the supply chain. So where is the paper sourced? What's the condition of the factory? Why aren't there factories in New York anymore making paper? These types of questions.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any thoughts about that? About maybe a next step, even if it's a small one for someone to consider?
I think just supporting smaller projects. I think it's easy to get sucked into, conglomerate owned. It's like when Starbucks buys smaller coffee shops and they leave the same sign up there just to think you're going to a smaller store, but it's actually just more fucking Starbucks. Just really supporting small publishers, smaller enterprises, smaller neighborhood stores, and just really build community with the people that are really in the same boat as you. Because at the end of the day, you're really just a consumer. You're just basically a product for these larger companies, and they don't care. So, and they don't have to ask you when they do things that are messed up. So, I think just really forming community and supporting other small businesses and small projects as much as you can.
Yeah, absolutely +1 to worker co-ops and small projects. I I don't know, the example that always comes to mind for me is the Black Panther Party breakfast program. It's like find something small where you are and like everybody can make breakfast for people. And then when you have breakfast together, you can start to have political conversations and sort of one thing will lead to another. And
I think I share a really cute story about Jeffrey Lewis, amazing cartoonist, SUNY Purchase alum. He lucked into this beautiful rent-stabilized apartment that was like built by the Swedish government to promote social housing.
Through a lottery.
Through a lottery. And the way he kind of gave back, I feel like, was having these like nights where he would just invite all of his cartoonist friends over to just hang out and draw together and have a meal together and I'll bring snacks. And like little things like that like are really important to do. We're very, very isolated, especially post-COVID. And I know it's dangerous and not everybody is like physically able to meet in person and hang out in person a lot. But it helps a lot to just meet regularly like that.
Okay, well, unfortunately, I wish we had more time. There was one hand in the back, though. Did you have a question still that you wanted to ask?
Well, I think that everybody's contributions were really incredible. I think that there was a point, okay, where you were talking about how there needs to be struggle sessions and there needs to be thoughts on how we can improve execution. So there's both the people in this room, but maybe this is being live streamed, maybe it'll be on the internet later on. And I think that we were talking about earlier about the power of memes and like all the viral stuff that's going on. I think the political consciousness is improving. There's lots of things going good all over the place. But if you just had a magic wand and could, through the power of these video cameras on the side, talk to all of the political artists at both LOCA and the world and say, how can we improve our execution? What will we be doing in those struggle sessions? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I have been in some of those rooms sometimes because, there's like groups that organized against Warren Kanders, getting him off the Whitney board. And they do town hall, they were doing town halls about that. And what I said to them there at the time was like, we should be thinking so much bigger than we are about this stuff. It's not about playing whack-a-mole with board members or faculty or bad publishers or whatever. It's about thinking way bigger than that. The entire structure of the new museum, its founding already went through all of this. I can't stress enough how Obama's always trying to push, the arc of progress bends towards justice. We're losing. The gains that were made in the 70s do not exist in New York City anymore. And that should be number one. How do we rebuild that? How do we go back to how the new museum already figured out how to make an institution where the janitor is paid the same as the director. Everybody's paid the same. We need those type of institutions, and anything less is garbage and just going to keep producing garbage. There's no way to reform a board. There's no way to reform a system that is fundamentally creates the hierarchies that creates exploitation. So that's what I said then was it's not just about Warren Kanders. I think it needs to be a huge, much more broad political horizon about institutions, and I think my thinking is aligned with David Graeber on that too.
All right, well, thank you. I think that's a great note. And so let's thank all our panelists for being here today.
I'm so bloated.
Okay.